afternoon, so maybe not 100% attendance. Anyway, so welcome. Now we're recording, and this is our last event in the US in the Globe, the Global in the US, a view from the Southeast Periphery series. And we're really happy to have Professor Zuoyue Wang here today to speak on the very historical and yet timely issue of Chinese American scientists and US-China relations. Before I turn it over to my colleague Shellen Wu in history, just a few thank yous. First of all, to the committee that's been helping put this series together, which includes Shellen, my colleague in sociology, Alex Moulton, who's presenting at a different workshop today, Tori Olson, also in history, and also there are a long list of co-sponsors who have made this series possible and hopefully will allow us to continue into the next year. So that includes first and foremost the Haynes Morris Endowment Fund. It also includes the Center for Global Engagement and the departments of sociology, history, geography, political science, and anthropology, and then area, as we were talking just a moment ago, a regional area program in Africana, Asian, Latin American, Caribbean, and Middle East studies. So Africana has become a department here at UT this year. So that's kind of a change. We also were chatting before we started for people on campus, because I know some have registered from other parts of the country or maybe the world. We have an AAUP reception at the University of Tennessee that starts at 4 o'clock, and I'm hoping to make it to the end of this talk. I'm on the committee this year, so I will be running across 5 minutes from here to that reception. And if you're on campus, after the whole event finishes, you're welcome to join that reception. We will be welcoming Dr. Anming Hu back to UT. So it's a kind of a AAUP reception in honor of his acquittal and return to the University of Tennessee as a tenured professor. And with that, I will turn it over to Shellen to provide the introduction to today's talk.
Okay, well, it's my great pleasure today to welcome Dr. Zuoyue Wang to give today's talk, the final event for the US and the World Global series. So Dr. Wang is one of the pioneers, the first really people to do this field of Chinese American science and transnational science in the US. I think in the old days at the History of Science conference, it was maybe you and Fatih, the only two people doing non-Western science. And now, of course, it has grown so much. And my only regret is that we couldn't host you in person and to do some tours around here for Oak Ridge and other sites around town. Dr. Wang's research is in modern science, technology, and politics in the US. He is the author of a 2008 book, In Sputnik's Shadow, and also numerous articles on science and science policy topics. In 2011 to 2014, he was the recipient of an NSF grant on Chinese American scientists, transnational science in the Cold War and beyond. And that is also the topic of his upcoming book. So perhaps you can tell us today when we can hope to get the book out. In 2019, he was also elected a fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. So we're all eagerly looking forward to this talk today.
Thank you, Shellen. Thank you, Paul. And thanks everybody for coming to the talk. I do regret not being able to make the physical trip, but maybe in the future, we'll have further collaborations, and I look forward to visiting both you, the university and the surrounding areas. So let me go to share screen, PowerPoint. Okay. And the title of my talk, as Paul and Shellen said, will be on Chinese American scientists and US-China relations from a historical perspective. So on this title slide, I have my email address, zuywang@cpp.edu, and also my homepage. You can find just searching for my name. Even if you misspell my name, I think you can still find it. I found a book review of my book that misspelled my first name. But anyway, so you're welcome to contact me with any further questions, or exchange afterwards. So this title slide, the image is at the beginning of the pandemic, I was asked by the Chinese American National Museum in Los Angeles to give a talk on Chinese American scientists. So I went to Google and did a search, and somehow they had some kind of a preset category, scientists, Chinese Americans, and this panel came up. And it was kind of interesting to me to see who were kind of selected at the top, presumably based on search results. And to me, what's really interesting is how maybe Chinese American scientists in the life sciences seem to be well represented in this panel. I'll talk a little bit more about them later on. I also want to say a few words about this woman who Shannon sent me an earlier version of the poster. I don't know whether Shannon, did the image get used for the final version of the poster?
Yes, yes.
Okay, all right. So I want to say a few words about the woman featured on the poster. Her name, in the image from the Library of Congress website, she was identified as Miss Ting, being a medical practitioner, but she was in fact a very distinguished physician who had much influence in China in the first half of the 20th century. So I think it's very worthwhile to spend a little bit of time on Dr. Ting. So her Chinese name will be rendered as Ding Maoying. And so she was born in 1891 in Zhejiang, but she grew up in Shanghai, where her father, Ding Ganren, was a well-known physician. I think was a Western, so-called Western physician. She then herself came to the US for her undergraduate study at Mount Holyoke College. And then she pursued medical education at the University of Michigan from 1918 to 1922. And I think the photo used on our poster was from 1919, when she was a medical college student. And then once she received her medical degree, she returned to China and served initially as a physician, and then very soon, I think within a few months, as the head of a major women's hospital in Tianjin, a major city not far away from Beijing, because the existing head of the hospital just passed away suddenly. So she took on the challenge and actually worked at that position in Tianjin for several decades, including during the Japanese invasion of China. I think she was actually arrested by the Japanese military for a few months, but she persisted and really was, I think, a heroic figure in modern Chinese medical history. And in 1929, she had a chance actually to come back to the US, to Michigan, as a Barber Fellow, which is a well-known program set up to bring Asian women to the US for higher education. And so she took advantage of that fellowship and studied prenatal care and wrote a book in Chinese that was published back once she returned to China that became very influential. I'm sure it saved many people's lives because of the influence of her book. And then after the establishment of the PRC, the People's Republic of China, after the communist forces took over mainland China, including Tianjin, she, for a variety of reasons, decided to leave China. And apparently in that period, she was still able to. So apparently she made a smooth transition for the hospital to be taken over by the new government. And she just left Tianjin, went to Hong Kong, where she had a brother there, but she didn't stay there long. She went to England and then eventually came back to the US, where she practiced as both a physician and an instructor in medicine and nursing at many institutions, hospitals, and schools. I guess in Southeast, I noticed in the name of your program, emphasizing the perspective from Southeast US to the world. So she did serve in Southeast US, in Florida, Mississippi, and also Northeast US in Connecticut and Massachusetts, including serving as a physician, I think the head physician and instructor at a college. It's called Turbulence College, which is a historically Black college in Jackson, Mississippi. So I think it's worthwhile to celebrate, to honor Dr. Ting as a medical scientist for her dedicated service to both the Chinese and American people. So I'm very honored to have my talk, to have my image featured in connection with her image on the poster. Very briefly, I'd like to maybe first give some, this is the kind of abstract I sent to Shannon when we talk about how to shape the talk. So I want to talk about three things. One is I do want to talk about how the experience of Chinese American scientists historically, both in terms of their contributions to the US, but also in terms of the hardship, the political conflicts, including persecution some of them had experienced. And the other point I want to make is to connect the experience of Chinese American scientists with what has been happening in recent period, especially in terms of the intensified US-China conflict, geopolitical conflict, and also the increase in hate crimes against Asian Americans and Chinese Americans during the recent COVID-19 pandemic. And finally, trying to draw some lessons. I know that both Shannon and I, as historians, we're reluctant to speak about the present or even less the future because we don't have the information that's not public that we need for our historical studies. And we don't have the perspective that will come from the lapse of time. But I think nevertheless, it's important and perhaps even useful to connect the past with the present. So I'd like to draw a few preliminary, I guess, lessons. Hopefully that'll be useful to those of you who are not historians. So again, speaking of the recent past, I'd like just describe some of the major geopolitical changes, both in China domestically in the US, and also in terms of US-China relations. The domestic political change in China, I'll say it as tightened and controlled by the party state in China has been a major factor, both in terms of the Chinese politics, but also in influencing US-China relations. And also in the US, we have had more divisive society and the politics in the US, and also increasing conflict between the US and China over trade and many other areas. And also the COVID-19 and the 2020 presidential election all have produced all kinds of divisiveness, both inside the US and also between the US and China. And the election of President Biden has at least helped with the public messaging on the issue of discrimination or hate crimes against Chinese Americans, Asian Americans. And now most recently, with the brutal Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022, that still is playing out in the US, in the world, and also in terms of US-China relations. So to give you a couple of examples of the increasing tension between the US and China, during the last year of the Trump administration, the US Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, came to Southern California to give a speech at the Nixon Library, in which he pronounced that securing our freedoms from the Chinese Communist Party is the mission of our time. He even questioned the engagement policy that the US government has pursued ever since Nixon. He says that's going to be ended. And then even after the election of President Biden, he announced that we must prepare together for a long-term strategic competition with China. And even in terms of public attitude, 89% of Americans in this one survey in March 2021 viewed China as competitor or enemy. So I guess those of us who have studied Chinese American history, Asian American history, I call it the first law, come to this first law of Chinese American studies. So my sense is that US-China relations almost always inevitably affect the lives of Chinese Americans and even Asian Americans, regardless of your political views, regardless of your stance even toward the Chinese Communist Party. So it's everything is turned into a racial and ethnic point of view in the US in a way. So speaking of the rising hate crimes against Asian Americans, Chinese Americans, it's been well documented, including by this organization featured on this poster. It's called Stop AAPI Hate Youth Campaign by brave young Asian Americans who spoke out against such hate crimes. And also, as I mentioned, President Biden did issue a very strongly worded presidential memorandum, I think right after his inauguration in January 2021, to condemn and call on the country to combat racism, xenophobia, and intolerance against Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders in the United States. Let me set my timer to make sure. Okay. As Paul mentioned, as Shannon and Paul both mentioned, that I'm sure our colleagues at UTK are very much aware of the U.S. Justice Department's China initiative, under which one of your colleagues, Professor Amin Hu, was prosecuted and was found not guilty by the judge. And I understand that there will be a welcoming back reception for him. And I applaud you for your support of Professor Hu. You know, everyone should be presumed innocent until proven guilty. That's the American principle of justice. I'm glad to see that Professor Hu received a measure of justice that way, but I'm sure I have heard his presentations at several webinars, including one sponsored by the American Physical Society. So I know that he and his family suffered a great deal. So if we look at the origins, the history of the China Initiative, there's kind of prehistory. I'll go into that a bit more, but for now, I'll just mention this case of Professor Xiaoxing Xi at Temple University. He was arrested in 2015 on what turned out to be false evidence. So his case was dropped, but not after, but it's only after he and his family suffered a great deal. And then the program itself, the China Initiative, was established in November 2018. And as we now learn, a very large number of people have been investigated a number of them have been tried, and a very large number of the people being investigated have been Chinese American academics and scientists. So while there have been some guilty pleas, and I know that there are trials still going on, but there have already been widespread criticisms of racial profiling in the running of the China Initiative, and also as you know, the Professor Amin Hu was declared innocent, and also Professor Gang Chen of MIT had his case dropped again for lack of evidence. So about a year ago, a group of very prominent Chinese American scientists and others signed open letter to the US Congress calling for hearings and investigation of the apparent racial discrimination and racial profiling in the running of the China Initiative. So the signers included Professor Stephen Chu, a Nobel Prize winner, and also the former Secretary of Energy under President Obama. And I think due to efforts of scientists, Chinese American scientists like Stephen Chu, and also the brave actions of people like Professor Hu and Professor Gang Chen, who refused to plead guilty when they knew that they had not violated any American laws, and other brave advocates in the last few years for the civil rights and the constitutional rights of Chinese American scientists. The US Department of Justice announced the end of the China Initiative in February 2022. But as I'm sure many of you are aware, apparently most of the cases started under the program have continued. And so we need more transparency to see what actual changes are taking place. So I have thought about the rights of Chinese American scientists. We usually speak of the importance of contributions made by Chinese American scientists, but I don't think that's how we justify our rights. Our rights should be justified on our human rights, right? We are all human beings. Chinese American scientists are human beings. So the US is a party to the United Nations Human Rights Declaration. So we have minimum rights should be guaranteed by the Human Rights Declaration. Many of the Chinese American scientists and the academics who have been investigated by the US government under the China Initiative are US citizens. So we also have constitutional rights and civil rights. Even if you're not citizens, you should still be protected by many of the civil rights and constitutional rights as specified the US laws, right? So we should, our rights should be guaranteed by those laws, not by our contributions. And also, finally, again, as I said, it's just a historical fact that Chinese American scientists and other Chinese Americans, Asian Americans are often influenced by US-China relations. And finally, I want to make a point about the importance of institutional responses at times of political turbulence. One can think of the 1950s during the McCarthy era and the current era we live through at a time of US-China geopolitical tension. It's really important for institutions to stand up to support members of their communities. So in this regard, I think MIT has been singled out by Asian American and Chinese American civil rights organizations for its strong support of Professor Gang Chen. And I'm glad to see that UTK now has also restored Professor Amin Hu's professorship. So just very briefly, the kind of broad characteristics of Chinese American scientists. We can think of several aspects. One is the diversity, right? It's a multi-generational They come from different origins, from mainland China, from Hong Kong, Taiwan, and other places in Southeast Asia, where maybe some ethnic Chinese scientists come to the US and they become part of the Chinese American scientific community as well. It's interdisciplinary in the sense that Chinese American scientists work in many different fields, in many different sectors in American society, including academia, universities, industry, and the government. And in different sectors, they face different kinds of challenges, obstacles, or as well as, I guess, have different opportunities. The other part of the character of the Chinese American scientist I want to point out is often it's actually the US government that encouraged Chinese American scientists to become involved in US-China scientific and educational exchanges during the good times, I guess, during times when US-China relations are warm. But then when the relation turns tense, sometimes the Chinese American scientists will be scrutinized and even investigated or prosecuted for actions that used to be encouraged by the US government. So in terms of the historical period, we can divide the period into maybe three big markers. One is 1949. That's at the time there were about 5,000 Chinese students and Chinese scientists or academics in the US when the Communist Party took over mainland China. So many of them had to make a decision whether to stay in the US or return to China. My current book project, as Shellen mentioned, is does focus on this 5,000 Chinese scientists, well, students and scientists, most of whom studied science and engineering. So in the 1950s, about 1,300 actually went back to China, but also about 4,000 of them end up staying in the US. So that's a big turning point. And then for the next 20 years or so, there were very few Chinese students who were able to come from mainland China to the US. There were a few that I've documented, but very few. But most came from Taiwan and Hong Kong. Some of those actually had originally left the mainland. They were born in mainland China, went to Hong Kong and Taiwan, and then came to the US for graduate studies. And then the next turning point will be Nixon's visit to China in 1972, and even more so in terms of the turning point, it will be 1978, when US-China reached agreement to establish diplomatic relations that opened the door for people to come, for students to come from the mainland China to the US. So I count myself as part of this wave, and Professor Shellen Wu, I think, is a part of this big wave as well. So if we go back to the pre-1949 period, so students began to come from China to the US in the 19th century. There was one government-sponsored program that was stopped very quickly, only after dozens of students came, because the Chinese government, the Qing government, thought that they were too quickly Americanized. But others came with support of American missionaries in China or private funding, but very few in number. One big program that had a big impact was the so-called Boxer Indemnity Fund program that sent a couple of thousand at least Chinese students to come from China to the US in the first half of the 20th century. So many of the founders and the leaders of modern science and engineering in China actually came out of this program. And so this is a picture on the right of, this is, I think, the second cohort of Boxer fellows who were sent from China to the US. So they included Zhu Kezhen, who became the leading meteorologist and vice president of the Chinese Academy of Sciences. Hu Shi, who later became president of Peking University and also Chinese ambassador to the US, was in this group. But also Zhao Yuanren, who became a leading Chinese linguist in the US. I think he served as the president of the Linguistic Society of the United States of America in probably 1940s or 50s. So for that period, most students, after they finished their studies, they go back to China. So this is a picture of the a group of the Boxer Fellows and other Chinese students who together founded the Science Society of China, which became the first general science society, most influential in the first half of China, once they moved the society back to China in around 1918. So this is a picture of a group of Boxer Fellows in 1935. And so the person here in the second row, that's Chen Xuesen, who became well-known aerodynamic scientist. So as I mentioned, around 1949, there were about 5,000 Chinese students who had to make a decision. So among those who stayed, 3 physicists became very well known. T.D. Lee and N. Yang won the Nobel Prize in Physics in 1957 while they were in the US. And but their discovery was actually experimentally confirmed by the experimental Chinese-American physicist C.S. Wu. But many people felt that it was unfair for her not to share that prize with them. But for that period, from 49 to about early 1970, Chinese-American scientists mainly pursued professional developments, try to stay away from politics. They suffered racial discrimination, but also during the McCarthy era, they were often also targeted for any kind of suspicion that they may be still pro-China, even though they choose to stay in the US. So it's the 1960s, late 60s, 70s, I think the political change in the US gave them a voice. The civil rights struggle really, the success especially of the civil rights movement really emboldened them to speak out. There was a well-known incident of the Diaoyu Dao dispute where they spoke out on this issue. And then Nixon's visit to China in 1972 encouraged more of them to engage, to visit China and to engage in scientific and educational exchanges with China. So this is a picture of T.D. Lee in the middle and N. Yang here, with other Nobel Prize winners. And this is a picture of Nixon's visit to China in 1972. And then the next milestone, as I mentioned, was the re-establishment of diplomatic relations between the US and the PRC announced in 1978, but formally established on January 1st, 1979. And along with that was a major decision by the US and China in the start of resending large numbers of Chinese students to the US. So there was anecdote told by President Carter that he was waking up in the middle of the night to get his authorization by Frank Press, who was his science advisor then in Beijing, for China to send 5,000 students. So Carter said, let them send 100,000. And then within a couple of decades, that indeed, the number exceeded 100,000. So in 2013, President Carter made a speech in which he says there were then currently 235,000 Chinese students in the US. He said that he was very proud of that achievement, and they said it was that's what it takes to break down the cultural differences. So given that kind of enthusiasm for US-China educational exchange, I think it's a big contrast with the more recent, especially during the last presidential administration, all kinds of restrictions placed on Chinese students. And some of the restrictions have continued, and which is making those Chinese scientists, Chinese-American scientists and students now having to make a decision whether to stay in the US or return to China. So not only did they engage in scientific and educational exchange, but in the recent article, a book chapter that I wrote, it's called A Controlled Exchange. I found that some Chinese Americans actually play the role of, I guess, people-to-people diplomats, right? So here was a case of TDD that I mentioned, the Chinese American Nobel Prize winning physicist, longtime professor at Columbia. I found that in 1988, he was able to help a group of US scientists headed by Wolfgang Panofsky to get connected with Chinese scientists headed by Zhu Guangya. Li happened to know both Panofsky and Zhu Guangya very well, but Panofsky, who was trying to engage Chinese scientists in nuclear arms control, couldn't get connected directly with Zhu Guangya, who was the head of the Chinese nuclear weapons project. So Li simply told Panofsky, come to lunch tomorrow, where to Panofsky's surprise, Zhu Guangya was also present. So the two of them got connected and talk about how to continue the dialogue on nuclear arms control. So this is I call it as a good example of TDD playing the role of a physicist diplomat. And then I found more evidence of Chinese American scientists. Again, in this case, it was TDD, who was actually in China, in Beijing, in 1989, when the Chinese government launched the crackdown on the Chinese student protesters in Tiananmen, resulting in the world famous Tiananmen tragedy. And so TDD tried to do something to improve the relations between US and China in the aftermath of the Tiananmen tragedy. So he went back and met with the new Chinese leader, Jiang Zemin, and also the existing leader, Deng Xiaoping, in September. So when he came back to the US, he was invited to the White House to meet with President George H.W. Bush. So again, here was a case of Chinese American scientists trying to play the role of diplomat in improving US-China relations. Again, very quickly, I want to just say a few words about the group of Chinese American scientists featured in when I did a search on Chinese American scientists in Google. So here is C.S. Wu. As some of you may know, that she was featured on a new stamp last year as a well-known Chinese American scientist. And perhaps I know I'm conscious of time, so I want to say a few words about some of the well-known cases of Chinese American scientists who were caught up in US-China conflict. So the best known probably was Qian Xuesen, or H.S. Chen. He was a professor of aeronautics at Caltech in 1950 when he was arrested for allegedly trying to shape classified information to China. It turned out none of them were actually classified information, but he was accused of having joined the US Communist Party in the 1930s. He denied, but the US government said that he violated the US immigration laws by not disclosing his membership in the US Communist Party. So in 1955, he was allowed to return to China as a result of a Geneva conference between the US and China. He became a leader of the Chinese space program, and is probably now the most celebrated Chinese scientist in China. So there have been some recent research findings. One is that there's new evidence showing that he probably did join the US Communist Party for a few months in around 1938, 1939. But at least in my own research in the FBI files on him, there's even the FBI acknowledged internally that there was no evidence that he ever served as a spy or a foreign agent. So there's a well-known book by Iris Chang. It's called A Thread of the Silk Worm. which is still the best source, except that Iris did not have the evidence that he joined the US Communist Party. And then there was a recent BBC radio documentary on Chen that I was interviewed for, and you may be able to find. There's another case recently discovered by the journalist Mara Vistadel, Harry Shin. He was investigated, lost his job, and under a program in the US Justice Department, surveillance essentially on Chinese American scientists, which in a way is kind of precursor to the China Initiative. The Wen Haoli case, a well-known case from 1999 to 2000, again, due to the press time, I won't go into detail, but I wanted to mention that the Chinese American scientist did protest his treatment, criticized the racial profiling, racial discrimination. And so here's a picture of a Chinese American engineer, Charles Xie, meeting with President Clinton. And I happened also to write a letter to the LA Times before Wen Haoli was, most of the charges against him were dropped. He pled guilty to only mishandling nuclear information. But before that, actually the judge apologized to him. But before that change of events, I wrote a letter to the LA Times. I essentially said that, I hope that he was not prosecuted because of his overseas relations, which was accusation charged against Chinese American scientists who returned to China during the Cultural Revolution. Many of you are aware of the case of Xiaoxing Xi and also Sherry Chen. Xiaoxing Xi was given the Sakharov Prize by the American Physical Society for his speaking out against racial discrimination against Chinese Americans. And Sherry Chen still is fighting for justice in her case. And most recently, there was a New Yorker magazine article just last month. It's titled, Have Chinese Spies Infiltrate American Campuses? And in which the author gave not only the charge by the US government, but also tried to interview Chinese American scientists to get their side of this China initiative. And in the end of the article, the author interviewed me, and I made two comments. One is that I think that historically, whenever the US turned inward trying to search for internal enemies, it's very easy to veer into McCarthyism or violation of American civil rights. I think a better response would be to increase investment in science education, as what happened in the aftermath of the Soviet launch of the Sputnik satellite in 1957. And finally, I made a comment that today too many people see too much risk in US-China scientific interactions, but we should not lose sight of the need for US-China scientific interactions or international scientific collaboration in general, because many global problems that affect the US national interest that need to be solved with international scientific collaborations. You think of public health crises like COVID-19, you think of a nuclear weapon, think of climate change, right? All that require international scientific interactions. Okay, so finally, I want to end here with a few quick comments. One is that, Chinese American scientists have engaged in US-China scientific and educational exchange, and those activities were often encouraged by the US government. And as I argue, they are necessary for solving global problems. And also, I think Chinese American scientists, academics should be supported when they speak out against racial discrimination. They have very much broken the model minority constrictions on Chinese Americans and Asian Americans. A few books, if anyone wants to pursue these topics, you're welcome to look into, especially Mara Vistadel's recent book on The Scientist and the Spy. true story of China, the FBI, and industrial espionage. Lessons, right? What can we draw? The one lesson I will draw is that at times of international geopolitical tension, it's incumbent on everybody in all organizations, but especially institutions like universities, to protect the rights of members of their communities, especially their civil rights and constitutional rights. And also, we should not lose sight of the need for international collaborations in science and engineering, especially by ethnic American scientists. In this case, I refer to Chinese American scientists in US-China scientific exchange to solve global problems. And finally, yes, of course, we all as Americans, we should follow American laws and the regulations, but the government, it's incumbent on the government to protect our rights, to avoid racial profiling or discrimination based on national origin, which is explicitly prohibited by 1964 Civil Rights Act. Okay, so I rushed a little bit, but welcome any questions or comments. Thank you very much. Paul, you're still here.
Thank you so much. That was great and so relevant. And actually, I have a question because you're absolutely right that there is this correspondence between US-Chinese relations and also the direct effect on Chinese Americans. But I think what is so alarming in the current period is, on the one hand, this is part of this increased polarization of American politics, right, and this turning inward. So this is, not just China, but rather this more extreme version of polarization. And as part of that, the China issue now seems to be very much politicized, but also to the extent that even whether you're Republican or Democrats, no one will come out and say, you really can't come out and say these things politically, whether you're Democrat or Republican. And, so how do you see this kind of change?
Right. That's of course it's a big issue facing everybody, not just Chinese Americans, not just the Asian Americans, but every American should be concerned with the potential danger of racial profiling, of violation of our human rights, constitutional rights. Especially, I think those rights, especially important at times of political tension, both at home and internationally. We see that playing out in, for example, in the US Congress, right? So some of the funding measures to increase fundings in US science and education have been passed with the justification that they will help the US to compete with China. It received bipartisan support. And also a measure to support Ukraine also received bipartisan support. So I'm not saying, of course, that's wrong. I very much advocate for the increase in US support for science education, as well as support for the brave Ukrainians fighting against the Russian invasion. But that kind of a bipartisan support only for that kind of measures sometimes tend to maybe intensify this kind of geopolitical conflict and also make the probably politically convenient in sometimes in terms of the not paying enough attention to the danger of racial discrimination. Because bipartisan consensus is not always the best policy. We had bipartisan consensus on the Vietnam War, for example, right? And that turned out to be a disaster. So I think that again, the point I'm trying to make is, especially at times of political polarization and geopolitical international tension, it's all the more important for the rights of American citizens to be respected.
Thank you. So we have a question from Paul about wondering about what you learned about the support or lack of support by close colleagues and universities of these scientists in their cases. So Paul is in the sociology department, so he's wondering if you see any kind of patterns.
Yeah. Well, I'm more familiar with the 1950s, and so historians who study that period, one of the general conclusions is that institutional response to McCarthyism was very weak in general. But once again, I think this may explain why MIT has done a better job in the eyes of many Chinese American scientists this time. I think it actually did a better job in the 1950s when some of its faculty members were accused of being either communists or fellow travelers of communism. And also in the case of H.S. Chen Xiusheng, he was a professor at Caltech. I think Caltech, looking back, also did a very good job in, again, in providing the support to him, including legal support. Again, based on the principle that one should be presumed innocent until proven guilty beyond a reasonable doubt, right? So I think that kind of institutional support was very important. Again, I hope more institutions in this current wave of scrutiny against the Chinese American scientists will be able to stand up for the civil rights and constitutional rights of Chinese American scientists and academics.
Thank you. So we have a question from Suzanne Wright about, have you done any comparisons with other groups, such as Americans of Jewish heritage, who have been accused by American agencies of spying for Israel in their case? I wonder if there are differences in the way these racial or ethnic groups have been treated.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So in my research, I want to make a couple of comments related to that. I don't have a clear answer to that because I have not studied the case of Jewish American scientists who have been accused of wrongdoings. But I know that many Chinese Americans in the early years, in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, very much draw a parallel between their experience and Jewish American scientists and academics. So in the early days, in the 1920s, 30s, I actually literally come across archival materials where a department chair will respond to someone who's recommending a Jewish American scientist as a faculty member. The chair will say, "Oh, sorry, we already have a Jewish person in our department, so the quota is already filled." And so Chinese American scientists were very much aware of the discrimination faced by Jewish American scientists and academics. So they use their struggle, the Jewish American struggle, as inspiration for their own struggle. So that's very clear. I see that many places where Chinese American scientists, academics use the example of a Jewish American fight for the remembrance of the Holocaust, but also to fight for equality in academia as a inspiration. So in terms of comparison of the experience of a Chinese American scientist caught up in US-China tension versus those Jewish American professionals, I think one major difference is that US-Israeli relations have been by and large been one of alliance in many ways. So there's not that kind of political pressure to search for spies, right? Within a Jewish American community, at least I think the pressure is probably not as pronounced as one faced by Chinese Americans and Asian Americans. You have the FBI director who, or even President Trump, right? Publicly or privately announced that the suspicion that many Chinese Americans probably are spies for China. I mean, just with that kind of broad brush accusation, it will oftentimes be turned into dangerous practice, right? Targeting Chinese Americans, especially Chinese American scientists. So that's one major difference I see between the two cases.
So we have a comment also from Deborah Zelickson about how in the 1950s, Jews were mainly accused of being communist sympathizers, not spies for Israel. So while there have been some such cases, the more common case is similar to the Chinese one of being othered and then seeing communism as the boogeyman.
Right, right. So it's ironic, actually. It's in so many ways, if you look at the experience of the 5,000 Chinese student scientists that I mentioned, so about 4,000 made the choice, conscious choice to stay in the US. So T.D. Lee said, I don't want to be brainwashed when one of his close friends decided to go back to China. But still, you had this FBI program starting in the mid 1960s all the way into 1970s, spying on Chinese American scientists like Chang Lin-Tian, who became the first Asian American president of UC Berkeley. Well, actually, the first Asian American to be the president of any major US research university. We got his FBI files. He was watched. He was, surveilled all this time. And then the other part of the tragedy is that those Chinese students and scientists who decided to go back to China, they were persecuted during the Cultural Revolution because of their American education. So transnational processes, one fraught with tragedies, dislocations. Both, we know about that in terms of the cultural sense, right? The dislocation of our identities. But for that group, they both literally suffered for their transnational experiences. I'm sure to a certain degree that happened to Jewish Americans as well, but I'm sure it's very different circumstances.
So other questions. So I'm wondering also now when your book is coming out.
I got, I found it, several problems. One is that I can't decide, whether I have one book or two books. I can have two books on the group who went back to China and group who stayed in the US, or just do one book that cover both. And also just the pandemic, and I'm getting more and more materials. So, so anyway, so I hope to get it within the next couple of years, but I have to get more motivated. I'm publishing articles so that but anyway, I should be working on that. So thanks for that pressure, Shellen.
Okay, sorry, I didn't mean to pile on the pressure. So we have another question for you about institutional support for Chinese scientists. Right. Deborah heard that Gang Chen's lawyer speak, and actually I think I also attended one of these events where he said the real difference between China and many other cases is that MIT is the only university to pay for a lawyer. Many of the people who have pled guilty did so in plea bargains because they could not afford attorneys and lengthy lawsuits. Are we seeing any increase in university support? Is there organized efforts to push university administrators to be more skeptical when the FBI comes calling?
Yeah, that's excellent question. So yes, I know that MIT did pay for Professor Gang Chen's defense costs, and also Caltech did pay for H.S. Chen's defense costs in the 1950s. And in that case, it was even, I would say, probably even more high-profile case where, the customer seized Chen's shipping of books, and he was arrested. Because also he worked in aerospace, which was thought to be very closely connected with national security. But I think it was to Caltech's credit that it also, provide all the support to him in that case. So I don't know whether other universities now beginning to provide more support to their faculty members who have been accused or been investigated. I hope they are, but again, I don't know the actual. My impressions is not, especially for state universities. I think they are probably under a different kind of political pressure than the MIT and the Caltech, which are private universities. So it reminds me of what happened during the McCarthy era in California in the 1950s. So University of California faculty were required to sign a loyalty oath during that period. Many people objected to, so they were fired, some of them, scientists. But some of them were able to go to work in Stanford, because Stanford was a private university. So I think that's kind of interesting distinction between private and public universities. So at least that corner of civil society, that does seem to make a difference. Because if you work in China, like in the 1960s, for those Chinese scientists who returned from the US, every university, every place of employment was a government institution. So you had no option of going to work for a private employer. So that's both in terms within the US and internationally. It's an interesting distinction, the value of private institutions in that sense, I think.
That's really interesting. So I did some research on Hopkins and Owen Lattimore. In that case, they didn't fire him. They just shut down the institute where he was the director.
Yes.
So that kind of solved the problem of the board of trustees' pressure to fire him.
Right, right. Yeah, even Caltech, the president, Lee Dubridge, was under a lot of pressure from the board of trustees, or whatever it is called. And but to his credit, I mean, he first of all, he believed that Chen was never a Communist Party member, which in that I think he was mistaken. But nevertheless, on the principle, I think he was right in supporting Chen before he was proven guilty. So so that's I think very admirable.
Thank you. So any other questions? If not, I'm going to stop recording. Okay, I'm gonna